Hello and welcome back to another Reaper tutorial. I wanted to share some insights on the best way to create click tracks that live musicians are going to use to record with. And this method is good to use if you don't have a Finale, Sibelius, or MIDI version of whatever you're going to be working with, but you still want to maintain some sort of rhythmic consistency with a click track. Our first instinct when doing something like this to get a natural sounding recording is probably to make a click track based on a live recording and map out every beat to the movements of the recording itself. And while I get the sentiment of that, it's really not practical for a human to be able to respond to a constantly changing click. So it might end up causing them to play more timidly or kind of have a seasick performance. And there are better ways to achieve that without using a click. So I'll cover that in another video. For now, let's talk about how to make a simple click that you can share with your musicians to ensure they have everything they need to produce a quality recording. First, let's start with the basics. You're going to go to your project settings, in File, Project Settings, and change the time base for tempo/time signature envelopes to beats, or you may have something that says beats position only, and you'll select that. Change the project start measure to -1. And then if you're going to be doing a lot of this kind of work, you can save this as your default project settings. Now notice over here, -1 is my start measure, then 0, and then 1. This is going to be important to have 2 bars of lead-in for you musicians when you're creating a click track. Next, we're going to add a click source, and this is going to let you export the click as its own file. So we add a new track using Control-T or Command-T on Mac. We can name it click, and you're going to drag and highlight with left click somewhere in the timeline. You can drag, and that's your time selection. Then we're going to click Insert Click Source, and it'll put a click source in there. So the first thing we'll talk about is how to change your tempo or time signature, and there are a few different ways to do this. The first way is pretty simple. You go down to this BPM and time signature window down here, and you can just change these directly and it will affect the tempo immediately. If you don't have another tempo marker in anywhere, it will affect the global tempo, so it will change everything. The second way you can do this is by right-clicking in the timeline and clicking Insert Tempo/Time Signature Marker. This will bring up this window, and what this does is it adds a tempo marker on the timeline. And now you'll see that something here at the beginning was added as well. And this means that now if we change our tempo down here, it will add a marker at this position rather than changing the global tempo. So just be aware that this doesn't always change the global tempo, just if you don't have any other tempo markers added. And the last method to change your tempo and time signature is using shortcuts. So my shortcut is set to Shift-C. So Shift-C will bring up that window really quickly. I can change the time signature and set the tempo from there. Something else you may have to do if you're creating a click track for musicians is to add a ritardando or accelerando, or in other words, to speed up or slow down the click track. And Reaper provides some really cool ways to do this easily. So let's say we're going to speed up from 50 to 80. We want to set a measure where the cello is going to start. So let me mark this really quick. And then we're going to set the measure where it ends. And we'll say that this is going to be 80. In order to create the cello, this first marker that we set, we'll need to have gradually transition tempo to next marker enabled. And so now this click will automatically speed up, which is very, very cool. Now with this, we can play through it and we can hear that it speeds up. And that's all fine, but for our musicians, they're not going to be able to respond to that. So what I like to do in this case is double the time signature, literally multiply it by 2. And for musicians, this might be a little strange, but in Reaper, what that does is it adds the eighth notes in. And then in order to make sure that it's not entirely confusing for everybody, we need to reset the time signature in the next bar. And so now, if we play this, it helps us subdivide and hear how much it's slowing down so we can stay together. Let's listen to that. So all of a sudden, it's much easier to follow. Now let's take a look at what Reaper is actually doing, because it's kind of interesting. So we're going to view our master track, and we can see the tempo envelope. And you don't really need to know what this does, just that what we're seeing here is that the tempo is increasing in a linear fashion up to 80. And we can also take this tempo marker and move it by just clicking and dragging, and it'll move it back, forward, a measure, however long you want that Accelerando to take. So this is really cool, and you can make really flexible click tracks with that. Now we're going to get into more advanced techniques, so we're going to start talking about how to handle fermatas in a click track. And you have a few options here. The first option is to just plan out how long you want the fermatas to be metrically. So you can add a beat, you can play them twice as long, etc. And you communicate that to your players via text in the score. So if we wanted to handle that, let's say that this bar had a fermata on beat 3, and we were going to hold it for 1 extra beat, we would just add 1 extra beat to this measure, and then the next measure, we would move that back to 3/4. So at that case, your musicians would know, hey, we're holding this fermata for an extra beat. To me, that's the simplest way, metering out the fermatas, but that's not always the case when you're working with a real situation. So you may have to make a long fermata, and I'll show you how to do that as well. So like I said, the easiest way to handle a long fermata is to just add the amount of beats that you decide it's going to be extra and call it a day. But let's pretend like you don't want to do that. You want to have a fermata that is not connected to a number of beats. You can do that as well. It's just a little bit more time consuming, but that's okay. So the whole goal here is that we're going to add a measure of click before the next downbeat when you're holding through a fermata. So let's pretend like let's go back in 4/4. So let's pretend that we have a measure that is a full whole note with a fermata over it. The whole measure is a fermata. And we want to hold that for some thing between 5 and 6 beats, but we don't really know where. So what I would do is I would listen through and kind of sing through the part, and then mark where you're going to put your fermata with the M key in Reaper. And now somewhere between where the fermata starts, which is right on the downbeat, and where it ends, you're going to add a tempo marker with no time signature change. And if you want to get to a specific point within the timeline, actually let me hide this. You can hit Control and click and it won't snap, or you can just turn off the grid. But I like to keep the grid on for the most part. So somewhere between where the fermata starts and the fermata ends, you will add a time signature marker or a tempo marker with no time signature selected. Next, we're going to add a second tempo marker around where we want the next bar to start. So I wanted to start right there and insert tempo marker. And we're going to turn the time signature on. So it didn't quite go where we wanted it to. So now we have to drag it over where we want it to go. And in this case, we're going to hit Shift because we want this to go to a specific place. And Shift is going to let us kind of get off the grid a little bit. So now you'll see this tempo got all funky. That's not what we want. So we're going to remove the click source here. And you can do that by highlighting and hitting S to split. And then I just move this all the way over by dragging. Anytime you see the little brackets, it means you can shrink or grow the item a little bit. So now that we've got just our first click and our click when the next bar happens, that's all great, but we need to let people know when to come back in. So to do that, we're going to go over to our click source somewhere later that's in the right tempo. And if you highlight a bar of it, hit Control and drag down, you should be able to grab just a little chunk of the click without having to cut anything or split it up. And once we do that, we're going to get rid of the Reaper adds a default fade in and fade out to these. We're going to get rid of those. So you zoom in. If you see this little icon, you can grab and drag. Then we're going to glue the items. And now this click source is no longer connected to the grid. It's its own wave file, which is really nice for things like this. So what we're going to do now is drag this back, and once again it's snapping to the grid. If I hit shift, I can slip it, it won't connect to the grid. And I'm just going to put this so that it's pretty much directly lined up with the start of the next bar. And this is great. So now when you're listening through the click, let's take a listen. Now your musicians will know that when you hear the 4 clicks, that means that the fermata is about to end and it's time to go on. So you could make this however long you want. All you have to do is get rid of this click source, move your 4 bars of click over, and now it's clear. But to me, it's not clear enough yet. I still like to add one more signal that says this is the beginning of the new bar when we hold fermatas. So I added a new track with Control T or Command T on Mac. We're going to call this the Q track. And I have a little sound that I just found, a triangle hit. But you can find any sound will do. You could use a clown horn, an air horn, whatever, it's all fine. Just something to signal that the new bar has started. So that's good. And now what we have is this. So here is the fermata. Everyone's holding and wondering when it's going to go on. 2, 3, 4. Okay, and now they know we're on to the next bar. So it's really helpful just to be completely clear in the click tracks when you can, especially if there's no reference track that you're making for this. And these triangle cues are good not just for fermatas, but also for rehearsal letters and big moments that you've marked in the score that people may need to just reference as they're recording through. So that's it for creating click tracks from a score. And there's still a lot of considerations to be made. So every click track is different, and you may have to do some funky things depending on how the time signatures work out. If it's a very rhythmically complex piece, if it's very slow, if it's very fast, there are different things to consider. But you can use these skills to get started in the right direction. And in the next video, we'll talk about setting chord changes so that your musicians have some reference pitches to rely on if you don't have the finale file or anything like that to work from. But for now, I hope this tutorial helped you reap the benefits of Reaper.